Hi there, everyone. I'm Iliako, and today I'm going to talk about solutions. It's easy on BreadTube or the internet in general to find folks who are critiquing liberalism or any other ideology, but it's relatively less often that you'll find folks offering up comprehensive, specific alternatives. There are plenty of flavors of socialists, and I'll talk about them later, but that's really about it. You don't really see a whole lot of churning out of new ideas for how to systematically change the whole of society. And that's for an obvious reason. It's incredibly difficult, it's incredibly time consuming, it requires a lot of thinking, it requires a lot of going back and cross-checking to see if your idea for a solution here doesn't cause more problems in area B, and so on and so forth. And anybody who has ever critiqued liberalism will tell you that it is designed to suck our time and energy away in a manner that kind of makes that impossible. But I've spent the last 5 or so years of my life going through that process, for lack of a better word, learning as much as I can, talking to various people. That has been my hobby and my life's work. And not to toot my own horn too much, but today I am finally ready to confidently present a system that I do think succeeds in solving the problems of liberalism without creating other problems in different areas. And so that's what I'm going to do today, is talk about that. I'm actually going to read an essay that I wrote about it. You can find it in the description. It's 10,000 words, 27 pages, so get some hot cocoa. The essay, like I said, is called The 12 Principles of Integration. And here we go. In this essay, I will be presenting 12 principles of integration that can be rightfully conceived of in one of two ways. On one hand, one might consider the principles to be a series of reforms to the liberal tradition and an evolution of it. Such a view is certainly fair, and I certainly view what I'm advocating for as being something that could be easily and readily transitioned to without a major upheaval of the interests of any class of people as is. On the other hand, one might view the principles as an outline to a new type of state, certainly an evolution from liberal democracy, but the reforms I'm advocating for are not merely policy changes or crackdowns, they're structural in nature, and are aimed toward cultivating a different set of primary state goals than modern liberalism. That's not to say the goals are in conflict per se. Liberty is incredibly important. It's just to say that they're aimed toward different ends. And before I elaborate on those 12 principles, I do find it necessary to explain just what I'm trying to accomplish here and why. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, one of the most influential philosophers of all time and my personal favorite, views history, that is capital H history, as a process, as a series of different formations of governance in response to each previous era's style of governance that eventually works toward a singular goal: human freedom. It is important to differentiate between freedom and liberty here. Liberty, that is, lack of direct restriction by another person on one's own actions, is one ingredient of capital F freedom, perhaps the most important, but it is, in my opinion, and in Hegel's opinion, not the only ingredient. Though he doesn't draw the distinction himself, Thomas Hobbes does make this point clear with his hypothesis on the beginning of the state, that is capital S state, what Hegel would call the beginning of history, also capital H history. He points out that in a state of nature, the world as it existed before humans started forming governments, people have maximum liberty and yet are not free. They lack the security to work toward their own self-fulfillment. They almost always lack the support and means to do so. Usually their actions have little meaning. So people semi-willingly decided to enter into what's called a social contract and form a state in order to make life better for themselves. Here I must note, though, it's unlikely that this was a single historical event or that the initial formation of the concept of the state actually happened in this manner. It's also most certainly not the case that the humans who started the process of the state were intending to start a millenniums-long process. More likely, They simply wanted security or to expand their personal power or whatever. The process of the state, hereafter the process of history, and by the way, these words state, history, liberty, freedom, they're all capitalized because we want to show that they're technical terms, basically. We're using them in a technical sense to mean a specific thing. But anyway, the process of the state, hereafter the process of history, need not be a process that any of its enactors are actually aware of, but Hegel argues nonetheless that due to basic laws about how the world works, that the initial formation of the state was inevitable, and that while the details of the process may be in flux, the end is clear: the realization of human freedom. So from there, Marx and others influenced by Hegel theorized that the end of history would be stateless, that is, without a government. This needn't be an anarchist or socialist point, though. The idea here, and one that a lot of folks subscribe to, is that the process of history, by its own mechanisms, removes the need for a formal state. Such a society wouldn't be in a state of nature, though. The whole process, the whole 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years of statecraft and states changing and evolving will have fundamentally changed how people operate with one another. The realization of human freedom makes it possible for people to interact with each other within the framework of an informal community, but not a formal state. There are no longer any arbitrary restrictions on one's liberty, but a mutual and informal web of obligations and responsibilities do exist that didn't exist in the state of nature, which counterintuitively ensures people's freedom rather than restricting it. That was a lot of technical mumbo-jumbo, so where am I going with this? Well, Hegel would characterize the era of liberal democracy, that's the era we're in, as one era in the process of history. It was responding to the internal contradictions within the pre-existing eras that had become clear and trying to fix them. In particular, it seems fair to me to say that the liberal era has been about securing people's liberties as much as possible, without throwing away the concept of the state that has made securing those liberties possible in the first place. And in this manner, it has succeeded wonderfully. But, like all eras before, the internal contradictions have started to become clear, not just to hoity-toity intellectuals, but to the everyday person who simply notices the hypocrisies of society around them. This essay is not meant as a simple critique of liberalism per se, and so I'm not going to get into the details of every problem with liberalism, though I'm certain the listener has already thought of at least one. But I, for my sake, will lay out one example. Liberal democracies have made a natural alliance with capitalism as their chosen economic system, and it has been a prosperous alliance, certainly. That's contentious with some people. A lot of folks have issues with capitalism. That's not the point of this, though. Because liberalism is focused primarily on securing liberties, it has, by its very nature, had difficulty putting industries or multinational corporations in check when they engage in actions that are within their liberties but are counterproductive toward human flourishing, or worse, trample on others' liberties. That's not to say that liberal democracies can't position themselves against the forces of capital on occasion. They can, and they have. But it's difficult for a liberal democracy to do so because liberal democracy is simply not oriented towards solving those types of problems. That just isn't what the liberal era is for. For a prime and relevant example of this, consider the fact that liberal democracy is the dominant ideology of the world, and yet has proven woefully underprepared to combat the threat of climate change. Again, that's just not what the liberal era is for. It's never going to be able to solve that problem. So, we've established that the era of liberalism, if not outright coming to an end, as some would argue, is at the very least nearing a crisis, where it will need to be heavily and structurally reformed. Here is where I will return to Hegel and Hobbes and add a claim of my own. In the grand scheme of the process of history, We first gave up on some amount of liberty to achieve some security and other needed ingredients for freedom. Now, in the liberal era, we've enacted the structures by which that liberty can slowly start to be reclaimed and afterward protected. It is my view that this represents the summit of the process. We're on the home stretch. Further eras of history ought to focus on the steady integration of individuals into their communities at every level, reaching all the way to the top of the hierarchies within, and on the integration of those communities into the state apparatus itself, such that the state will be slowly subsumed into being nothing more than the communities which form it. It seems trivially true to me that as the difference between the state and the people it governs becomes smaller and smaller, the state itself organically dissipates without the need for or consequences of violent revolution. Moreover, having gone through such a process, the people are organically imbued with and organically learn how to properly wield what I'll call responsibility or meaningful action. Again, I'm using those terms in a technical sense here, and what I mean by them is that their decisions will have a real and visible effect on their lives, the lives of the people around them, and on their community and the world as a whole, and that those decisions are meaningfully different than their alternatives. It seems to me that this is one of the ingredients of freedom, and one that we as a society can start to work at imbuing in folks. By setting up the state such that the very mechanism by which we imbue folks with meaningful action is the same mechanism by which we start the slow subsumption of the state into the community / the people, we can ensure that both happen smoothly and properly. Without further ado, here are the 12 principles of integration by which we can transition into an integrationist state, which ought to be the dominant ideology of the next era of history. Alright, principle 1, starting off with quite a banger. Enact guild-based representation. This is the largest principle and the cornerstone of the entire program. A simple blurb is going to fail to do the whole thing justice, and so I'll continue to write and talk in greater detail about this principle elsewhere. But the purpose of this whole thing is to provide an overview. So here are the major details of the guild system. In classic breadtube fashion, I have organized these into a numbered list. Important point number 1, the communities that citizens belong to are no longer purely geographically located, and thus representation ought to no longer be purely geographically based. This is based on the assumption that the reason that we have representation in the first place is because you belong to a community, that community needs to be represented, and we don't do direct democracy. But now that we're in the year 2022 and the internet has fundamentally changed the way all of human society works, people are in so many communities that have nothing to do with geography. And those communities need to be represented because they're so important. A lot of the times they're more important than people's geographic communities. So that's what the guilds are. Important point number 2, guilds are political organizations that count as non-geographic representative districts. 3, guilds, like other districts, will be granted self-chosen representation based on their population, though importantly, unlike geographic districts, having a population below the typical amount required for a representative doesn't automatically grant you one. Otherwise, people could just go and start a guild and it would just be them and they would get outsized representation. No. In order to even get one representative, you do have to actually get past the threshold with how many people are in the guild. Also, important point number 4, each citizen will only be permitted to join a certain number of guilds, perhaps 3 or 4. Thus, the proportion of guild representatives to geographic representatives will be relatively stable. I'll talk a bit more about that point here in a little bit. Important point number 5. In practice, guilds will be like an amalgamation of an interest group, a political party, a labor union, and a government department under some versions of integrationism, while being none of the above purely. They're first and foremost representative of a community. Important point number 6. Anybody will be able to found a guild, and the guilds can be about anything. A guild could be about advocating for women's bodily autonomy, or about the needs of supply chain workers, or environmental regulations, or advocating for policies that the Baptist Church supports, or it could even be a community that simply all like Dogecoin, whether for serious or meme reasons. There may be, and likely will be, multiple competing guilds at any given time focused on the same subject. There might even be guilds that are competing despite having more or less agreement on the details of that same subject, simply because they don't like the way the other guild runs itself. More on that in a minute. The lack of restrictions on what a guild can be represents the real impossibility in laying out constraints on what constitutes a community. Important point number 7. They will be self-governing, which is to say that they may make requirements of members and decide who to send to the legislature as a representative, however they like. And they'll be self-regulating. Citizens will be able to leave guilds to join different ones. If they're unsatisfied with the way a guild they belong to is run, they might join or even found a competing guild. Unlike many current systems, though, and this is important, this isn't a losing move. Sapping population away from a semi-competing guild directly leads to your preferred guild receiving more representation. Contrast this with a US election, where sapping votes away from a badly governed Democratic Party who isn't properly catering to your interests results in Republicans securing a plurality of the votes. They win the election, your third party doesn't get any seats, etc., etc. An important note here, consider this. How many Green Party members are in the United States? Like, what percentage of the population would ideally be Green Party members? 5% maybe? But they never really win any seats because that 5% is spread so thin. Under the guild system, theoretically, and this is simplifying things a bit, there could be a Green Party guild, an environmental protection guild, or whatever. And if 5% of the population was in that guild, they would have legislatures. They would have representatives. Important point 8. Fluid guild membership will also allow for the ever-changing relative importance of various issues to dynamically and organically affect how much direct representation each issue gets. Important point 9. Guild representatives will typically be representing a less ideologically broad set of citizens than geographic representatives, and will thus tend to have more specific platforms, and broad political coalition parties will have less of an influence over them. They'll also, by virtue of being sent to advocate for a specific set of goals that they themselves are pre-selected for having a vested interest in, are less prone to corruption, have less of an interest in making details that compromise the integrity of their platform, and have a greater interest in nonpartisan compromise that does accomplish the soul of their platform. They'll also have been pre-selected as being people who are the most likely to be experts who care about their subjects, and thus the most equipped to understand which compromises actually do accomplish the soul of their platform, and which compromises degrade it. Important point number 10. Due to the nature of how guild representation is proportioned among the population, no guild will ever approach anywhere close to half the representation, providing a bulwark against political parties. This one's a little bit weird, so put your thinking caps on for just a moment, because we're going to do some fractions. So here's an example. Say your nation estimates that approximately 1/3 of the communities that folks belong to now are geographical in nature, and 2/3 are non-geographic. Your nation might set things up such that each person can join 4 guilds, and each person is counted twice toward the population of their geographic district, and thus the geographic district ends up with twice as many representatives as if you had just counted them once. All right. So, this would result in guild representatives occupying 2/3 of the seats in the legislature and geographic representatives occupying 1/3 of the seats. Since each citizen is in 4 different guilds, and one actually counted as 2 geographic districts, any one guild can have at maximum 1/6 of the seats in the legislature. And that is if 100% of people were a member of that guild. However, that wouldn't ever happen. Such a situation would literally, as I mentioned, require every citizen to be a member of that guild. Putting aside the likelihood of the entire nation being in consensus on a set of issues, the scenario would represent just that, consensus. There would be no demand for such a guild in this situation. There would be no need for political advocacy on the topic. It would simply already have been resolved with wide nonpartisan support, and whatever guild there may have been would just dissolve. So, important point 11, I've run out of fingers. I ask the reader, I guess listener, to consider the beauty here. The guild system ensures that there are representatives in the legislature who are solely there to represent their issue and nothing else, such that minority concerns have guaranteed direct representation, and that majorly popular concerns that are disadvantaged in a system where each representative is representing a diverse swath of interest, for example, climate change concerns, also have guaranteed advocates directly in the halls of power who are solely concerned with that subject. At the same time, the system has an organic bulwark from a coalition guild slowly gathering a majority of the electorate and having unilateral power, and thus negating many of the advantages that the guild system was designed to bring. Certainly, there will be coalitions between guilds, and certainly the broad coalition political parties that exist today will have some influence, especially among geographic representatives, but that influence will be organically checked and disallowed from its most ruinous effects that we see at the present time. All right, Principle 2. Enact votes of no confidence for geographic representatives. I've spoken much of the guild system, and it truly is the cornerstone of integrationism, but we ought not make the mistake of undervaluing folks' geographic area as a source of their community membership. Just because it's 22 and we have the internet now and it's changed everything, doesn't mean people don't still go outside. So I'm not going to dawdle on geographic representation that is too much. It's straightforward and has been the standard in liberal democracies for centuries for a reason. However, it has become clear that there is an incumbent problem. Due to a variety of just basic facts about how human minds work, about how much effort the average citizen can actually be expected to put towards researching various candidates, and about the networking opportunities that will just always be available to incumbent candidates, no matter what restrictions are otherwise placed on them, it is extremely difficult to vote out incumbent candidates. This is problematic because the end result is often a representative who just doesn't have the support of the majority of the population and thus doesn't actually represent the will of their community. Worse even is when the incumbent is widely believed to be engaging in behavior that is shady or otherwise contrary to the interests of his or her constituency, and yet his detractors are unable to oust them despite being a majority of the citizens in a district, whether it's because few people exercise their right to vote or any number of other reasons. I've spent many words now describing a problem that nearly everyone is familiar with and wants to fix. The solution is simple. Come election time, an incumbent geographic representative must pass an unopposed vote of no confidence. If they fail to garner a simple percentage of the vote, 50% is the obvious target, but there are valid arguments in my mind for 52 or even 55%. Only then does an election occur, and they're not allowed in the election. An incumbent candidate only ever runs against themselves, against their own record. New blood always runs against new blood. This serves to ensure that the geographic representatives are more representative of their constituency, and also further enables citizens to oust them when they're not, something that will become incredibly important for some later, more controversial principles. Alright, Principle 3 is admittedly a little bit dry. With all that said, Principle 3 is enable guilds to be involved in relevant policy implementation. This one might also actually be a little bit controversial. After all, are the guilds not already directly involved in policy crafting? Certainly. However, there is a difference between crafting policy and implementing policy. Perhaps this is merely my US bias showing, but in the States, the legislative branch crafts policy and the executive branch implements and enforces it, the implementation of which is done through various government agencies such as the EPA, the IRS, and so on. It seems to me that if we're already allowing experts in fields to have a direct role in crafting policy, then they are the most qualified to implement the policies relevant to their area of expertise as well. One might counter and point out that such government agencies are already filled with relevant experts in their fields, and being uninvolved with policy crafting allows them to remain nonpartisan, and that's true. That's certainly true. However, I will remind the listener of the intent of this program: to integrate people into the state and slowly dissolve the difference between the people in the state. Moreover, these organizations need not be dissolved per se. I'm not going to advocate for a particular direction here because there's a billion possibilities, but it's conceivable that a state could be set up such that the guild that wrote a piece of legislation that passes simply advises the relevant department on how the implementation ought to be performed. Or, on the more radical end, the state might be set up such that any given executive administration might designate a particular favored guild to act as their department of such and such, so long as the guild is actually relevant at all in that area. Again, I'm not really going to make specific prescriptions here other than the broadest and vaguest idea, which is still important to include, that the various state bureaucratic institutions that are responsible for implementing policy ought to be integrated into having a less discrete divide between themselves as a branch of the state and themselves as a branch of the community. Principle 4 is implement universal basic income. This one's another more exciting one. So, in order to successfully integrate people into the state, one of the most important prerequisites is that we enable people to become the best versions of themselves in a kind of broad sense, and enable them to dedicate more of their effort toward contributing to their community in multiple organic ways. The following set of economic reforms are oriented toward that goal. I'm actually going to put in a slide here that's not written in the script because it has occurred to me that nowhere in my actual script do I talk about exactly what UBI is, or at least I can't find it in this read-through. So I'm going to go ahead and explain that first. Universal Basic Income is a program where the government, from one funding source or another, there are various ideas on how it would be funded, instead of or in addition to normal welfare payments or healthcare subsidies or whatever, provides a direct payment, no strings attached, of the same amount to every citizen every so often, usually every month, right? So the most famous example in the United States is Andrew Yang wanted to do what he called I think it was called the freedom dividend, where he wanted to send everybody $1,000 every month. First, I want to recognize that universal basic income is a hard sell for a lot of folks. The idea that we ought to subsidize lazy people to lie around idly while others are being productive is an affront to many folks' moral sensibilities. Strictly for the purposes of this essay, I'm going to just wholeheartedly agree with those folks and accept the above prescription as fact. With that in mind, allow me to present a few axioms in the form, again, of a numbered list. Axiom number 1, nobody who is able to work should receive less compensation for working than for choosing not to do so. Axiom number 2. People ought to be compensated for the ways that they contribute to their community. In other words, work is synonymous with contribution to one's community. Axiom 3. Some ways of contributing to one's community produce less immediate economic profit in a market, and we ought to have a mechanism by which those contributions are compensated still. Axiom 4. Capitalism works best when the markets are most competitive. And Axiom 5. Markets are most competitive when the barrier to entry is low. The easier it is to get back on your feet and rejoin the competition after you fail, the fiercer the competition will be. I'll readily admit those are a bit leading, and not all of them are really axioms, but I believe most laymen and experts alike would largely find the above points to largely be true. So with all that in mind, I'm going to share an anecdote from my own life, actually. When I was in high school, my single mother of 3 did not work a job for 3 straight years. She was, in my view, contributing to her community with compensable work merely by raising 3 children. That's a huge job, but nonetheless, she didn't work a profit-producing job. This wasn't due to an inability or any sort of character defect, though. The system as it is set up nowadays, in the US anyway, is such that had she gotten a job and contributed even more to her community, she would have lost many of the benefits that we were afforded and relied on. She would have literally received less compensation had she decided to go and be more productive. I think many will agree with me that this is a travesty, and not the sort that we hope happens less often than it does. I think this is the sort of travesty that should literally never happen. At the same time, consider axioms 2 and 3. My mother was doing work and contributing to her community by raising 3 children, and in an integrationist state, she would be contributing in an even more direct way by virtue of being an acting member of multiple guilds. Here, I find it necessary to remind everyone of 2 facts. First, we've already kind of reached a consensus as a society that folks who work toward crafting or implementing public policy are in fact doing work and ought to be compensated for it. There's admittedly some debate over this idea, at least in the United States, but the debate is typically more focused on whether the folks who are tasked with that job are actually doing it. Secondly, the guilds are not going to be mere vote aggregators typically. They'll be made up of folks who are passionate in a given area, doing research, advocacy, generally pushing their field forward, even and especially in cases where their field of specialty isn't a typical paying job. In an integrationist state, there simply aren't people sitting around and doing nothing. That's just not a thing that happens, really. Not only does an integrationist state directly enable people to put more effort into the unpaid labor that they're already doing with the universal basic income, but it compels everyone who isn't already doing so to find some areas that they're passionate about and advance them. In an integrationist state, everybody works, and everyone gets paid for all of the work that they do. Any extra work that they choose to do to someone else's benefit ought to end up with them being paid extra. Moreover, this setup enables people to contribute to their community in the best way they can in multiple areas. Not only does the universal basic income enable them to contribute more to their chosen guilds with less fear of economic despair, but UBI also makes it so that, broadly speaking, every penny you earn working for someone else is a penny available for you to invest directly into competing in the market, whether via a small business or buying stock of other companies or whatever else. A libertarian-minded person might argue that this is the case nowadays, but like libertarians typically are, they're wrong. This isn't the case. Every person has a sort of flat tax that they have to pay for basic living expenses, and it has to be covered by your wages before any investing can occur. I don't seek to eliminate economic disparity in any sense, but this is a tax that disproportionately affects low-income workers' abilities to actually even participate in capitalism. As mentioned above, I believe that markets are most competitive when the barrier for entry is low. Even a low-income individual ought to be able to readily and easily save up a bit of money and start a small business without the fear that if the business fails, which it is more likely to do in a more competitive market, by the way, that they'll be made destitute. Ultimately, we want the market to be an indicator of who is providing the best service to society and to reward that person the most. But it can't do that to its fullest capacity unless everyone, even the lowest wage worker, has ready access to competing in that market. Even the most ardent capitalists should be able to see that this is simply not the case under our current system. Universal basic income is not some government handout from those who are productive to those who aren't. It's the method by which we can enable everyone to actually compete to the highest degree and make capitalism as strong and fruitful as it can be. This section has been long, but I'll lastly remark on the elephant in the room. How do we pay for what will inevitably be a huge expense? I'm not going to make a specific prescription here, since the overall principles are more important for my purposes than the details of their implementation, but I will lay out some vague ideas. The first idea is to eliminate the income tax and replace it with a hefty capital/property tax/land value tax. I'm learning a bit about those right now. This method taxes the folks who end up benefiting the most from the universal basic income program because they purchased capital, they invested, they started a small business, whatever. Plus, more people will be purchasing capital and less people will be having like a traditional income. And so getting rid of the income tax doesn't actually hurt that much. The second idea is to set up a blockchain that monitors government data, including voting records, government expenditures, as well as the universal basic income purchases. People have a lot of issues with blockchains right now in general, but I tend to view them as a bit of misplaced distrust, because personally I think that NFTs are the bigger issue and that blockchains themselves actually do have a lot of use for society, but I digress there. So how this one would work is that would be the stuff that it is verifying, and we would have everyone's personal computer contribute toward that blockchain and use the distributed tokens as the universal basic income. We would set it up such that a percentage of the tokens are sent to a null wallet with each transaction, and also while sitting over time, such that the circulating supply is constant. This method, super complex. I think it'd be really good for a lot of reasons, but it's admittedly real complex and technical. Don't worry too much about it, and if you hate blockchains, don't worry too much about it. You can advocate for the one above. Principle 5, ban corporations from being storefronts. Their role is to be supply chains primarily. This is a spicy one. Okay, so this principle is meant to work in tandem with the universal basic income in order to establish small business ownership as a viable economic model of production for citizens. This is vital to an integrationist state for two chief reasons. First, we must systematically work toward abolishing coercive relationships that are created by the structure of our society if we truly do wish to establish capital F freedom. Corporations have done an immense amount of good for society. I know, another controversial claim for some folks, but I digress. The option to have a simple and steady supplemental income by working for another person must remain secured. But when relying on another for your livelihood is the only obvious, known, and viable option for a majority of people, we cannot rightfully say that the choice to do so was freely made. Second, directly interacting with and servicing one's community is one of the best ways to integrate oneself into their community. The direct economic interactions between two individuals who are mutually accountable to one another are of particular note. They often result in inefficient economic actions for the sake of providing a better service to one's fellows. This human element of recognizing another person and sacrificing some amount of economic efficiency is absolutely vital to the bonds that hold a community together, but they are rightfully completely absent in the realm of corporations. Even in the world of small business, such economic inefficiencies are no longer tolerable if one intends on keeping a business afloat, primarily because you're competing against entities who have no instinct or desire to do so. Make no mistake, these situations, vital as they are, ought not to be rewarded or made artificially economically efficient, but the ability for individuals to engage in what I'll call philanthropic inefficiency without being disproportionately punished for doing so must be protected. Universal basic income helps with that by lessening how punishing inefficiency is without artificially making it efficient, but we ought to go further. Both corporations and small businesses are vital to the functioning of society, but they fill completely different roles in society and ought to operate in completely separate niches, never to compete with one another. Small businesses ought to be storefronts, and corporations ought to be supply chains. So consider what good corporations do for society and what makes a corporation successful. You'll remember my claim that philanthropic inefficiency is rightfully completely absent from the corporate sphere. This is, of course, because the service that corporations provide to society is raw efficiency. Goods being readily available and arriving reliably and quickly is the task that corporations are designed for. Operating storefronts is merely a means by which that service can be provided. Oftentimes, corporations actually lose money on the storefront end, but continue to operate them as a necessary part of running their business. Oftentimes, this also serves the purpose of running competing small businesses out of business, such that the loss is recovered by a subsequent gain in customers. On the other hand, the small business is best at providing personal, human-oriented service, and the storefront is a vital area where such interactions take place. While there would be short-term growing pains, in the medium to long term, it seems to me that segregating small businesses and corporations in terms of competition would benefit both parties and society as a whole. Corporations could focus all their resources into optimizing their process without having to worry about the additional costs and inefficiencies associated with running a retail storefront. Small businesses would no longer be competing in the same arena as much larger entities who can afford to take a loss and squeeze them out. Many of you might already be aware that in the rural US, community after community has been ravaged by Walmart setting up a store and taking a temporary loss to drive every local business under and secure a local monopoly. I don't have an issue with Walmarts, but when corporations are banned from being storefronts, this won't happen anymore. I'll finish off this section with a brief example of how the two principles might work together to create positive situations. Imagine a man who holds no huge ambition and wants to spend his life creating art. Under a liberal capitalist state, such a man might have trouble finding a way to contribute to society in such a way that supports himself monetarily, while also contributing in the way that he is best suited to do so. He will most likely work a dead-end job that provides very little to society, if we're being honest, and sucks away his time and energy from where they could be better spent. In the worst case scenario, he'll spend his whole life contributing nothing, both in the productivity sphere and in the sphere he's best suited at, his art, because the material conditions of his life imbue within him a deep depression. On the other hand, he may succeed tremendously at monetizing his art to a degree that he's fully financially supported. This often brings with it the pitfall of severing his soul from his craft in our current society. Make no mistake, succeeding in balancing your economic well-being with the pursuit of one's passions is entirely possible in our current system. Folks do so all the time. But there are enough arbitrary and unneeded roadblocks to doing so that fatigue leading to failure is common, which means the blame cannot fully be put on the back of the individuals who don't succeed. In an integrationist state, this tension no longer exists, or it's at the very least lessened to a healthier degree. An integrationist state is set up such that the individuals can and will pursue their passions, great and small, in an environment that doesn't force them to successfully monetize them or neglect them, while, and this is important, especially for more conservative folks in the audience, at the same time, it provides the infrastructure by which even non-economically viable passions are often converted into real, tangible benefit to society. That's the guild system. Under integrationism, that same artist might finish his education and then start focusing on his art immediately. He might sell some of his paintings or poems, probably won't hit it big, but he need only sell a few paintings to keep the bills paid. If he does want or need a little bit more money, he might take a simple job at a gas station or a local bakery. He doesn't need to find something crazy in order to just live, but importantly, since so many folks are running small businesses and have less demand for bill money, he has a decent amount of bargaining power even as a single worker for a low-tier job. He's going to be fine, and even if he does find a need or want to work a low-tier job, there's not going to be this overwhelming depression because he's still going to be able to do his art. It's going to just be readily easily. An economically conservative person might bemoan the idea that we're enabling this man to engage in an economically inefficient lifestyle, but again, that's not the case. This man's true economic contribution to society is with the guilds he joins. He might be in a guild advocating for conservative social policies, or a guild that runs art museums, and so on. In each of the guilds that he's in, he might have specific responsibilities. Paying membership dues, which would mean he needs to work a bit more, leading a polling and research team, doing community outreach, etc. All of this labor directly benefits society economically or otherwise, and is likely related to his art. And yet, he's not destroyed his soul in the search of a way to make his passion economically viable. The system is no longer set up to prevent him from contributing in the best way that he ought to. It's set up to maximize the productivity and general benefit that he can provide to society by pursuing his passion. This is the economic future I envision under integrationism. Alright, Principle 6. Enact votes of no confidence for the central executive, 55% needed with a cool-down period. That's from the legislature. Principle 7. Continue to require the legislature to write bills, but only the central executive needs pass them. Principle 8. Give the legislature veto powers, 55% needed perhaps. Give the central executive veto override powers. Principle 9. Allow the central executive to serve for life if a vote of no confidence never passes. Principle 10. Ban the central executive and their immediate family from participating in economic activity, voting, and other citizenship privileges for the rest of their lives after they take office, even after being voted out. Alright, so that was quite a lot. But I've grouped these 5 principles together because they're working in tandem with one another even more so than the previous principles. So much so, in fact, that when examined individually, they give off the impression of being far more radical and far-fetched than they actually are. So I want to first look at principles 7 and 8, but to do so I must compare them with the current system in place in the United States to show just how subtle the change actually is. So, under the current US system, a congressman writes a bill, typically within a committee. Then Congress votes to pass the bill, typically requiring over 50% of the votes. Then the president has the ability to veto that bill, at which point Congress may override the veto. Compare that to an integrationist state. Someone in the legislature writes a bill, typically within a committee or their guild. Then, the central executive passes the bill. Then, the legislature can vote to veto the bill, which in practice is virtually the same thing as voting against passing that bill in the current US system. Then, the central executive can override the veto, which is virtually the same as his or her regular veto in the current US system. Then, and this is important, if the legislature becomes dissatisfied with how often their vetoes are overridden, or otherwise become dissatisfied with the central executive, they can institute a vote of no confidence to remove them, which is not analogous to the veto override powers they have in the current system, but it does still give them the last word over the central executive. Please note, I'm from the United States. I'm most familiar with our political system. I'm not unfamiliar with other political systems, but I know I've got some bias. I chose to compare the idea of an integrationist state to the US state, not because I view the US as the default, but simply to draw a comparison to show that the same basic checks and balances that are so sacred to the liberal tradition are actually maintained. We did get those right. What I advocate for is merely to shuffle them around a bit in a way that remedies some of the quandaries that have come to plague the electoral process of many liberal democracies. That's what these two principles are about. So, the questions still remain, of course. What does this adjustment accomplish? What problems are even being solved? Importantly, how does this tie in integrationism? So, there are three main direct things that these changes accomplish. First and second, it's both quicker and easier to pass laws. This may raise immediate alarm bells. The slow, deliberative process is a feature of liberal democracy to ensure that changes are well thought out, not a bug. True. While the necessity, though, to ensure changes are well thought out must remain, almost everyone on any side of the aisle has come to realize just how debilitating the inaction of congressional deadlock can be. An astute listener might point out that congressional deadlock is typically caused by a partisan breakdown of good faith negotiation between political parties with wildly different fundamental goals and frameworks through which their goals and those of their opponents are viewed. And if we're limiting the influence of these parties with the guild system, the partisan deadlocks will be less common as well. I won't deny the truth of that. That's true. By the same token, however, the guild system ensures that representatives will be more specialized in their knowledge and in their platform. Explaining a complex policy to thousands of other representatives to the point where they're capable of intelligently voting on it would be chaotic, time-consuming, and nigh impossible. This is already the case in the US, with only 535 representatives, all of whom are intended to have a broad understanding of all of their associates' bills. So, a skeptical listener might say, wait, hold on a second. Is that not a downside of the guild system then? But in my view, it's just part and parcel with the reality that under the guild system, bills will be able to more meaningfully and detailedly address specific issues. When the task of law writing is performed directly by true experts in a relevant field through the guilds, rather than by a group being advised by some unaccountable experts and very often just as many folks with money on the line, the average quality of the legislation is simply going to be higher. Peer review still absolutely needs to exist, of course. It's possible to write truly heinous legislation through incompetence or malice, but the higher quality nature of bills written by the guild system allows us to apply that oversight on the rear end rather than the front end. So, after the central executive passes a bill that they liked that was written, again, by a representative, there will be a waiting period before it's enacted in which the legislature has the ability to step in and veto it. One might argue with the 55% figure I said above, my intuition is that we ought to avoid the process ultimately boiling back down to a parliamentary lockdown where groups have the fight. No. So, after the central executive passes a bill, there will be a waiting period before it is enacted in which the legislature has the ability to step in and veto it. One might argue with the my-cited 55% figure, my intuition is that we ought to avoid the process ultimately boiling back down to a parliamentary lockdown where groups have to fight to secure a full majority that actively supports their legislation. Again, this would be especially disastrous in a system where each legislator has more specialized expertise. I'm frankly not confident in my exact figure, nor am I even confident that it ought to require a majority of any sort. Perhaps it's better to be just more conservative and declare that any bill controversial enough to get reviewed at all needs only significant opposition that is not even a majority for us to say it ought not pass. Perhaps we ought to only count votes that are actually cast toward the percentage and not count votes abstained. Ultimately, I believe that this debate over the specifics is not one that integrationism has a hard answer for, Nonetheless, the guild system allows for the legislation process to become smoother and more efficient and more able to react quickly to crises without sacrificing the integrity that the current slower process is designed to ensure. The third immediate effect that setting things up like this would have is the reason it is core to the integrationist thought instead of just an isolated good idea. Erasing the boundaries between the governed and the government is one of the keys of integrationism, and certainly the guild system alone accomplishes a lot of that. However, part of the aim here is that the task of writing and examining bills should become less of an ontological description of someone, a lawmaker, and more of a simple description of an activity that everyone is collectively participating in, and the representatives are merely the spokesperson of. In a very real sense, these people aren't in the legislature to craft policy to suit their own ambition and agenda. The guilds are crafting policy with the representatives as their mouthpieces. This is no naive Republican fantasy disconnected from reality, by the way. These people are representing guilds that they willingly joined because their vision matches that of the guild. Moreover, the guilds are given more free rein over their representative selection. If they're dissatisfied with a representative for any reason, relevantly here, if they become too personally ambitious to be a proper representative of the guild. The real activity that a guild representative participates in, that the rest of their guild doesn't, is the process of familiarizing oneself with others' bills, critiquing them, and voting on whether to veto them if the need arises. This function is shared with representatives in a typical democratic republic, no doubt, but the relationship of guild representatives to their colleagues' bills is a little different. A typical republic's representative has a comparatively high level of personal interest in an average bill compared to the guild representative. The guild representative is sent there to care about a specific subset of issues and has a much shorter leash within which they might express their own opinions. A guild may even prohibit its representatives from voting on certain types of issues. They also represent a more homogeneous community which, in addition to the greater degree of uniformity of positions on cared about issues, will naturally have a greater degree of conformity on which issues are not cared about. In essence, the average guild representative has a more dispassionate relationship with their colleagues' bills. Consider this in tandem with the fact that the average bill will be more sophisticated and technical in reference to its subject matter, as discussed before, and it becomes clear that the true job of a guild representative as an individual is to dispassionately and technically critique the work of their colleagues. There's simply little incentive, mechanism, or room for personal political ambition here. As a note, freeze frame, some of you guys might have noticed, a seeming contradiction here. I'd earlier claimed that a group of thousands of field-specialized representatives is not well suited to the task of examining every bill as a group and voting on them, and I do stand by that. But it's a statement about the structure of the body as a whole. As individuals, those same field-specialized representatives are well-equipped to analyze and provide dispassionate technical critique to the bills of their colleagues, whether in fields adjacent to their own or that they simply have an interest in them. The guild system doesn't produce representatives incapable of performing the task of legislature. It simply makes full group discussions and voting on every policy kind of cumbersome. All of that was rather technical and admittedly a bit inscrutable, so what am I getting at? Why is it important? Refer back to when I highlighted the importance of dissolving the distinction between the governed and the government. Right now, there's an almost ontological difference between the lawmaker and the citizen. Far from the Republican dream, lawmakers are hardly a mere extension of the consensus of the governed. They're individuals exerting their power in service of their own political ambition and agenda. They're rulers in the truest sense of the word. This is no fault of any individual representative, by the way, nor is it a problem of corruption. It's a function of the interaction of two completely separate facts, both of which are completely innocuous on their own. Numbered list time. Number 1, the people who are tasked with editing laws are the same people who are tasked with imposing them. Number 2 is those very same people are incentivized to act as individuals. So, Integrationism does not remove the law editors from the lawmaking process, nor does it alter the lawmaking process in a truly fundamental way, but it does shift the burden of imposition onto the central executive and removes some of the incentive to act as an individual from some of the law editors, the guild representatives. Thus, the distinction between lawmaker and citizen, between ruler and ruled, is partially dissolved and oriented toward further dissolution, which is important. This section may be filled with subtle shifts dressed up as radical changes, but it is central to the integrationist mission. The reforms here are not merely structural, they're cultural as well. Subtle shifts in the relationship between us and our law editors can, over time, dramatically affect the way they are perceived and perceive themselves in relation to us. With all that said, let there be no confusion. The changes discussed in this section and integration as a whole do not fully and perfectly dissolve the aforementioned distinction. I emphasized earlier that there's little incentive, mechanism, or room for guild representatives to exercise personal political ambition, and while that is true, it's not as if there's no room. And furthermore, the guilds are self-governing. There will certainly be guilds that care very little or not at all about how their representative votes on issues not related to themselves. Perhaps some may even advertise it as a recruiting point. And I'm sure there will also be guilds that are basically just cults of personality that are entirely revolved around one person's political goals. This is not even to mention the geographic representatives who retain almost all of their personal political agency, though they too lose the burden of imposition, or the central executive, whom the burden was more fully thrust upon, or the various other offices in the various liberal democracies that create a distinction between the governed and the government. This is no admission of defeat, though. As long as there's a formal state, there will be a distinction between ruled and ruler, and as long as rulers exist, and perhaps even afterward, there will be a place in politics for personal political ambition. The citizens who select from prospective rulers who to give the keys to power to need to know who stands for what in order to make that decision, after all. But integrationism does start the dissolution of that distinction, and it does orient society toward being able to dissolve it further in the future. Whew, that was quite a lot. Next, though, is the matter of principles 6, 9... Oh my goodness. The matter of principles 6, 9, and 10, those concerning the central executive. Like the previous section, notions of a lifetime leader can bring immediate alarm to our Western sensibilities. How can we say that we're working toward dissolving the distinction between the governed and the government if we allow someone the privilege of reigning indefinitely, of having their whole human existence be defined by having been a ruler? A fair question. Some of you might remember that I mentioned several times that I do not believe integrationism to be the final era of history, that there would still be a state and still be a discrete differentiation between the state and the people that it governs, albeit one that was oriented toward dissolving. I also mentioned that some of the burden of imposition, that is, the responsibility of being the one who is imposing this power of the state on others, was shifted from the plural representatives to the single central executive. This was an inevitable result of several reforms central to integrationism, but it does carry with it a danger, hinted at in the same section, that comes about when someone who has the burden of imposition is incentivized by whatever structures are at play to act as an individual. When the person with the burden of imposition is imposing their individual will on the governed, those governed become mere subjects. The state then becomes a tool that the imposer bends to serve their own individual will. I'll make no prescriptive claims in abstract, but such a setup is antithetical to the integrationist mission of subsuming the state into the community. That cannot happen if the state serves another master. But we can take a cue from Plato here and prevent this whole conundrum. If the central executive who holds the burden of imposition is made incapable of having an individual will, or at least is heavily incentivized against doing so, we can ensure that the state is not hijacked, and that even if the central executive is imposing his will on us, it's not his individual will, per se, but the dispassionate will of the state itself pursuing its goals and not the goals of any sovereign individual. The manner of accomplishing this is simple. Make it such that the very act of assuming the position of central executive, of ruler, extinguishes one's very ability to act as a political individual permanently. This in turn retroactively dissuades anyone who intends to do so from seeking the position. Under integrationism, the central executive, the sole ruler, will have great power to act, to easily create policy for the short or long term. But in addition to the short leash they're already on via the votes of no confidence and the increased ability for people to select for representatives that will support such a vote, the central executive also faces steep sacrifice that takes effect no matter how long or short, how great or ineffective their term is. As a review, the central executive is responsible for working with the legislature to have laws written. They pass laws they're satisfied with, and barring a veto from the legislature, it goes into effect. They themselves have the ability to override the veto, but if they do so too often, they risk angering the legislature, who might pass a vote of no confidence and remove them from the office. If the legislature never decides to remove them, they may serve indefinitely. They possess a large amount of power to act quickly in the short term via the streamlined bill process, or to implement long-term oriented policies without the pressing need to win a re-election a short time later, preventing them from pursuing such strategies. At the same time, their leash is not too long. Any misstep bad enough could see them ousted. Moreover, getting ousted is particularly punishing for anyone pursuing the office for the wrong reasons. The moment a person takes office, they and their immediate family must immediately forfeit all capital assets besides personal homes, vehicles, and the like, and they'll never be given back, not even to the children. In fact, they'll be prohibited from owning or operating businesses for the rest of their lives. Their children may own or operate businesses after the executive passes away, but they still never get their capital returned to them. They do have access to a semi-unlimited treasury for personal expenses for the rest of their life, but even that can have limits placed on it by the legislature if they feel it's being abused. They'll also never be allowed to vote again. The children will after the executive passes. These steep stipulations reflect the loss of individuality we are looking to impose on the central executive. Voting and participating in capitalism are ways in which individuals form their communities and govern themselves. By becoming a ruler, the central executive has removed themselves from the community and is simply no longer entitled to these privileges. The harshness of these requirements also serves as a bulwark against bad executives. A person who enters office with corrupt motives or without a well-thought-out plan for improving the nation might quickly find themselves kicked out of office, having lost nearly everything. Ultimately, the office of the central executive has great power, even in our current system, and by restructuring where the checks exist and what checks are present, we can enable them to craft better policy than they can currently advocate for, while ensuring that whoever is in office actually does so. Truly, integrationism makes it such that the avatar of the state itself is not an individual ruling the community, but a person whose agenda is always in service to the community. Alright, home stretch here. Principles 11 and 12. 11 is abolish vocation-centric primary education, enact development-centric primary education, and then principle 12 is integrate law enforcement into service-based roles. I've once again grouped the two principles together and have left these two for last. I'd frankly considered not including them at all. That would have given me an even 10. And they're not exactly state structural changes after all, and they have this sort of vague general direction policies that don't lead themselves to specific prescriptions in a essay like this. But even with all that considered, I believe they're important enough to the integrationist project that they ought to be mentioned, even if only briefly and at the end. So I'm going to start with principle 12, as its importance to integration is far more obvious. There will always be a need for laws and law enforcement as far as I'm concerned. Be it as it may that a police force as we are used to today is largely a modern invention of the capitalist state. It's also the case, though, that gifting someone with the power of the state, even in limited circumstances, creates the sort of ruler-ruled divide that we're trying to combat with integrationism. And yet, it seems very difficult to have people enforce the laws without giving them some of that power. This catch-22 has been addressed by many folks with various solutions, and I'm not going to make a case for or against any specific solution per se, but it does seem to me that for any eventual solution to be both viable and effective, the stage must first be set. Changing the nature of law enforcement is among the single policy changes with the largest potential effect, which seems to me to ultimately be why so many folks are so hesitant about doing so, despite there being more or less universal agreement on the problem. Additionally, while it may very well be the case that the law enforcers do not conceive of themselves as rulers, the ruler-ruled relationship at play here does cause them to view the public in a particular way, as subordinates, as beings who ought to submit to their authority, even in cases where a law hasn't been broken. I'm not going to speculate on whether there are important reasons for that at this time, but it does have a negative side effect that even if systemic change was implemented nowadays in law, it wouldn't translate well, if ever, to the culture as a whole. In many cases, it would be outright ignored, but even in the best cases where the officers in a district actively support the changes, the relationship was already cemented in a particular way as far as both the law enforcement and the public are concerned, and the reforms may simply be ineffective at repairing it. If systemic reforms to the nature of law enforcement are to be successful, the relationship itself must first be reformed. That said, the best way to do this is not to simply have police do more community outreach or even acts of community service. Such token measures, even when done with the best of intentions, are shallow and transparently manipulative at best. The true solution is to make law enforcement but one job that people do within a greater service-oriented career. I envisioned something like a service corps, wherein the members are assigned to a variety of different projects depending on community need, and are trained primarily in the generalities of community service, with supplemental training for each specific job. 1 month, a person might be assisting construction companies building infrastructure, or working a soup kitchen, or doing police work. Whatever the list of possible jobs ultimately is, both the rotation and the service-oriented nature are incredibly important, and it's just as important that this is a viable career path like the police department already is, not a volunteer role, or additional duties for police officers, or any other half measure. The job of policeman should be fully replaced with the job of serviceman. I'll make no prescriptions on what police-adjacent supporting jobs, such as department secretary, actually count as police for my purposes here, nor will I get into the details of how such a change might work, disappointing as that might be to hear. The details are not actually that important for my point, which is far more about the fact that having law enforcement be just one of the duties of servicemen, formerly police, will help to change the relationship such that the folks who occasionally do have authority over others are in other cases acting as their servants. I'll note 2 things. First, I suspect a concern will be raised by many folks who will point out that a large amount of specialized training is often needed for police officers in places like inner cities where the divide is most heated and where crime is most violent. And fair enough to that. To this, I'll simply remind that I didn't disclude this in any sense. I simply included the importance of additional education. More education is always better. In fact, many would argue that servicemen or even modern policemen now ought to be a role that requires a particular college degree rather than just a certification. Additionally, I'll note that spending time in service of those areas will directly help these areas become less dangerous and crime-ridden in a way that I hope is obvious to everyone. Secondly, I'll admit that there are some state entities that are often grouped under the police banner, notably the FBI in the US, that this entire Catch-22 just it doesn't apply to. Not only are they utterly unsuitable to public service roles, but they also interact with the public so infrequently that the ruler status is less problematic all around. I'm frankly happy to let that problem be solved in a later era. Alright, so Principle 11 is less directly connected, but no less meaningfully so. It is simply the case that the disintegration of the boundary between the state and the community cannot reliably occur when the citizens are primarily educated on how to be better servants for the capitalist ruler class. As a matter of fact, this is so important, I'm literally just going to state it a second time. It is simply the case that the disintegration of the boundary between the state and the community cannot occur when the citizens are primarily educated on how to be better servants for the capitalist ruler class. It really is as simple as that in this case. Education ought to be about teaching folks how to think as effectively as possible, and secondarily about how to contribute fully and most effectively to society. There's truth to the claim that vocational education is a part of the latter, but consider how much you learned about raising children in school. Etiquette? How to run a small business? No. Upon examination, it becomes clear exactly what sorts of contributions to society our states deem to be worth focusing on in education. Education is, to be clear, not my vocation, and thus I, as I have often done, am gonna avoid hard prescriptions on this subject. I will, however, provide an anecdotal system from my own life that I believe provides a good framework. When I was in high school, I attended a summer program for gifted students with a curriculum I did not understand at the time. It was obvious it was oriented toward developing critical thinking skills, but a full one-third of the curriculum was dedicated to psychology, with another one-third dedicated to philosophy, and the last one-third dedicated to the subject you were attending for. I went for the mathematics program. A heavy focus on philosophy kind of makes sense for such a program, but I was puzzled for a long time about the emphasis on psychology as well. Eventually, I realized that they viewed psychology as something like the physical mechanics of thinking, as opposed to the abstract mechanics of thinking that is philosophy. In order to truly develop one's thinking abilities, you've got to kind of have a grasp of both of those. I don't believe that this program can be or ought to be extrapolated to the general education system, but their emphasis on learning how thinking works, the mechanics of thinking, and their ideas about what subjects are part of that did stick with me. I broadly envision a curriculum where one-third of the time is spent on how to think subjects such as the aforementioned two, philosophy and psychology, but also things like literature, logic, and writing. I view those as teaching the mechanics of thinking. And then one-third of the time gets spent on traditional vocational subjects such as the sciences, maths, language, and then one-third of the time is spent on how to live subjects such as various physical education subjects, as well as things like cooking, child development, etiquette, and personal finance, and so on. I'm not going to speculate on whether electives such as sports or band or drama or whatever else ought to be considered a separate category or integrated within the various categories in some way or whatever. Ultimately, I'm not even advocating for this system in any real way. I just felt it relevant to bring attention to the idea of having an enlarged focus on the various different subjects that constitute how to think, since it goes hand in hand with the type of educational reform that I am ultimately advocating for. Alright, last but not least is the conclusion. Ultimately, I don't have a lot to say in a conclusion that I haven't already said. It's my sincerest hope that everyone watching will see here what I see, how all of the above principles work in tandem with one another to produce a society in which the distinction between the state and the community, the ruler and the ruled, is oriented toward being dissolved over time. A society where people are enabled to their highest degree to contribute to their community in the best ways they can and at every level of their community. A society where people are truly enabled to become the most fully formed individuals they can and work toward achieving true human freedom. even better, I hope that someone who watched this whole video sees where I've gone wrong, where my vision is completely lacking, and uses this as a launching point to craft an even greater system, one that pales integrationism, and achieves the aforementioned goals so effectively that integrationism couldn't even dream of matching, and eventually helps lead humanity toward the same freedom that I'm seeking to help develop. Thanks for listening, everybody. Tell me where you disagree in the comments. Tell me where you think you agree in the comments. Tell me where you think I'm completely deranged. Or you can yell at me in the comments if you like. Call me a liberal. Call me a fascist. Call me a communist. If I don't see, all three of those in 3 different comments somewhere, I'll have considered the project a failure. Thanks for watching the whole thing, and I look forward to seeing what people have to say.